Immanuel Kant, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Section 2 by Dr. Israelsen. We'll begin with an overview of Kant's methodology, in particular his transition from Section 1 to Section 2 of this book. Recall that Section 1 of the Groundwork began with an analysis of common moral concepts. In the first section, Kant essentially takes for granted certain basic notions of duty and goodwill, as well as certain particular moral commands such as it's wrong to lie, to steal, and so forth. He does this in order to attempt to trace back to the root why it is that people so often and so ubiquitously around the world tend to believe such things. So we start with what we tend to think is true in order to see if we can get down and find an intellectual or foundational justification for those beliefs. In Section 2, Kant is arguing in the opposite direction. Where Section 1 began with common moral notions in order to clarify their foundations, Section 2 will argue from that foundation towards a justification of these common moral concepts. So where he took them for granted, that was only temporary, right? He's not taking anything for granted. He just wants to begin by saying, well, let's start with analyzing what people tend to believe to see if it can lead us in a fruitful direction. And indeed it does. Thus, in Section 2, Kant will be articulating and defending what he takes the true foundation of morality to be, the first glimpse of which was had by examining these common notions. So to chart his method here, in Section 1, the method is to examine common moral concepts. The direction of the argument is to dig down and attempt to find the goal, which is glimpsing the foundation of these concepts. Section 2 proceeds in reverse. We are engaging in a method of metaphysical investigation of these foundations, of moral foundations. The direction of the argument is now building up, and the goal is to identify and justify our actual moral duties. So we now begin Section 2 in earnest. That's kind of just an overview of the method that he's following. Kant begins Section 2 with an idea that I'm going to call moral self-opacity. Now, the word opacity is the opposite of transparency. Something is opaque if you can't see through it, right? So a window is transparent. A wall is opaque. It's the opposite of transparent. Kant begins Section 2 with the following line, quote, "If so far we have drawn our concept of duty from the common use of our practical reason, it is by no means to be inferred from this that we have treated it as an experiential concept." Okay, what is he saying here? Well, what he's saying is that duty is not a concept drawn from outer experience. It's not a concept that we have experientially. Well, we might first ask, okay, so what are experiential concepts? What does he mean by that? Well, it's just essentially all empirical concepts, such as our concepts of animals, plants, other people, colors, stars, trees, Paris, France, the Mediterranean Sea, or the Mediterranean Ocean, right? I mean, all of these sorts of things, these are all empirical concepts or experiential concepts. If someone has never before seen a golden retriever, they have no concept of a golden retriever. And what Kant seems to be saying then is that duty, or what he is saying, is that duty is not like that. Duty is not a concept of experience. It's not an experiential concept. Well, where then would it come from? Well, we'll see that in a moment, but here's what he says. He says, quote, "If we attend to our experience of the behavior of human beings, we meet frequent and, as we ourselves concede, just complaints that no reliable example can be cited of the disposition to act from pure duty. This is why there have been philosophers in every age who have absolutely denied the actuality of this disposition in human actions and attributed everything to a more or less refined self-love. This is, of course, the position of someone like Mill, who denies the capacity to act in this abstract, dutiful way, instead holding that the only things that can motivate us as ends are pleasure in the absence of pain, or a more or less refined self-love. So it's so uncommon, what he's saying, or it's perhaps completely uncommon, that we find someone who is able to act from pure duty. Right? So Kant is saying, yeah, it's not a concept that we have an experience with. On the contrary, this is why there have been so many people who have denied that it even exists in the first place, because everyone, in fact, seems to act out of self-interest. So we see then that unlike an experiential concept of tree or dog or house, Duty is not that way. It's rather an ideal of reason, right? Consider everyone you know, everyone you've met, everyone you've read about, right? Can you be certain that any one of those people has ever acted purely from duty and obligation? Can you be certain of that? And Kant's answer seems to be no. We can't be certain of it because we don't know if we have any experiences of actual duty. And in this regard, the concept of duty is much like the concept of justice. Right? This might be a little bit easier. Justice is generally seen, or at least we can treat it here, as something more of a wide-scale trait, like the justice or injustice of a society. Of course, we can also speak about a person being just or unjust, but let's focus in here on sort of social or widespread justice, right? Whether or not a state is fair, a civilization is fair and just. Well, clearly the human race has never seen an example of a perfectly just society. It's never happened. There's never been perfect justice on the earth. So justice is thus not a concept of experience because there has never been perfect justice on this planet. However, we still have an idea of justice as an ideal to strive for. Duty's the same way. It's an ideal. It's not something we can be certain that we've seen or that we can point to, like, oh, there's duty, right? It's an ideal. Kant doubles down on this and says, quote, "In fact, it is absolutely impossible by means of experience to make out with complete certainty a single case in which the maxim of an action that otherwise conforms with duty did rest solely on moral grounds and on the representation of one's duty." So recall this language from section 1, acting from duty as opposed to merely in accordance with duty. The shopkeeper and Betty, the friend of humanity, they both acted in accordance with duty, but as we saw, neither one of them acted from duty. From the outside, it may have looked like they were doing their duty, but it turns out that the shopkeeper was motivated by the crass desire for profit, and Betty was motivated by the desire for good feeling, for positive emotion. So the reason why we can't make out any particular case of duty with absolute certainty is that there could always be some creeping incentive of self-love, surreptitiously disguising itself as duty, as in the case of Betty, the friend of humanity. So let's take an example of this claim of moral self-opacity, because we might say, okay, fine, when it comes to other people, sure, I can't be certain why they do what they do. Who knows why Betty does what she does? Who knows why the shopkeeper does? But I know why I do what I do. We might think, well, I know my own motivations at least, right? Well, Kant says no, you don't. So here's an example. It's wintertime, right? And one night there is very heavy snowfall. My next door neighbor, let's call her Mrs. Williams, is very old and she suffers from bad arthritis. So of course shoveling snow is out of the question for her. Knowing this, I take it upon myself to wake up early and shovel her driveway in addition to my own before I leave for work. I decide to go and help out. Now, here's a question. Why do I do this? Why did I get up early and go and shovel Mrs. Williams' drive? What motivated me to do it? I mean, the answer I'm looking for here is not, well, because it needed to be done. Yeah, it did, right? But that's not the question. The question is, why did I do it, right? What motivated me to do this? Well, I'd certainly like to think that I did it because duty demanded it, right? Because I'm a good person. I like to think I did it simply because it needed to be done, simply because it was the right thing to do. But is that really it? Is that really why I did it? Maybe it is. Maybe I did it just because it's the right thing to do and I'm a good person. But am I sure about that? Perhaps I'm actually motivated by something else entirely. Suppose, for instance, that I have another neighbor across the street named Chad. Chad makes more money than I do, and he drives a much nicer car. His house is bigger and his lawn is immaculate. Chad's got a lot of things I just don't have. However, I think to myself, or perhaps I don't even think it, perhaps I don't consciously think this, but perhaps something like this is going on in my subconscious. If I'm the one to wake up early and shovel Mrs. Williams' driveway before Chad can get to it with his fancy snowplow, well, won't that show him a thing or two, right? Won't that stick it to Chad with his nice car and his perfectly manicured lawn and his 6-digit salary? This will show him. Now, if this would be for me to contentedly stick it to Chad, right, with this good deed, showing the whole neighborhood that he may have the money, but I have the moral high ground. Maybe that's really why I did it. And if that's really why I did it, then clearly, in that case, on Kant's view, my action has no moral worth at all. It's done, sure, in accordance with duty, but not from duty. I just wanted to look good in front of people. Now, this might sound pessimistic, like, well, gee, I think that I know myself better than that. But I think if you stop and reflect, you'll find that oftentimes when you did something, quote unquote, good, upon further reflection later, you realize that you were motivated by selfish reasons. It certainly happened to me. I'm not saying it's always the case, but certainly we've had those experiences where we do something that we pat ourselves in the back for, and then we get to thinking about it, or perhaps someone else points it out to us, and we realize, oh, I don't think my intentions were as pure as I thought they were. The general point Kant is making here is not, a depressing, well, I mean, it's a little depressing, but he's not trying to depress us. The point he's trying to make is that human beings are psychologically complicated. We don't have immediate access to all of our motivations. It's just clear that we don't, right? We do things, and sometimes afterwards we say, I wonder why I did that, right? We don't even know why we did it. What made me do that? Why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why did I behave that way? And it's very unclear what made us do the thing that we did. If this weren't the case, then there would be no need for, say, psychology as a profession. People go to psychologists because they don't know why they do what they did. They don't know why they're behaving this way, and they need the help of someone who has insight into the human condition and the human mind to help them clarify their own intentions and their own mental operations and psychological operations to themselves. So that's the first of what I'll call two warnings that kick off section 2 here. The second warning we'll call the danger of examples. It's kind of connected to this first one. Kant says, we ought not attempt to derive the concept of duty from experience, right? Not only can't we, right? It's impossible to actually derive the concept of duty from experience since we can't know that either I or anyone else has ever actually done their duty. But furthermore, it would be a bad idea to try. Well, why is that? Well, for the first reason is that it would simply provide ammunition to those who deny the reality of the concept of duty in the first place. Mill, who would deny such a capacity to act purely and simply from duty, if we were to try to empirically ground it or say, well, no, there's duty, here's a dutiful person, there's a dutiful person, Mill might say, oh, really? No, this person was actually just motivated by the hidden desire for money. That one was just motivated by the hidden desire for fame, right? So goes, there they go. And we might be able to do the same sort of thing with every person. Show how all of their apparently good motivations were actually at root selfish motivations. Now, unlike Mill, Kant believes that there really is such a thing as duty, but we can't ground it through experience. We can't provide any determinate cases whereby we know someone did their duty. Instead, duty must be founded on a priori rational insight, a priori again meaning independent of experience, if it is to have universal validity, not only for all human beings, but for all rational beings as such. Furthermore, to attempt to seek morality from examples is a bad course of action. So examples like, say, Jesus Christ, or the Buddha, or Krishna. We might think, well, sure, in our everyday life, we don't have, certainty regarding our own motivations, perhaps, or the motivations of someone else. But surely in these moral exemplars, we can look to them and say, oh, we know that they did their duty. Well, maybe they did, right? But we don't get our concept of duty and moral purity from examples. Even examples of moral and religious purity, for example, Socrates, Abraham, Jesus Christ, Krishna, Buddha, etc. We can't accept them as arbitrarily good. They're accepted as good and raised up to the level of exemplars because they conform to our innate ideas of goodness. Here's what I mean by this. Suppose that some of you asked your friend, you said, what's morality? How do I be good? And they say, you should just do everything my brother Steve does. Just do what Steve would do. You would say, well, okay, that might be a fine answer, but I'd first have to know something about Steve, right? And if it was a fine answer, it would only be fine to the extent that Steve himself already follows good moral principles, right? We pick out people and elevate them to the level of examples, not because they first furnished us with our principle of what goodness is, but because they conformed very well to a priori universal concepts of duty, right? So the examples don't come first is the point here. The examples come second. We first have to start with the principle and the concept, and then we can say whether or not this or that person, whether it's Steve or whether it's Krishna, then we can say whether or not this person is a good example of a moral being. The final warning that Kant ends with here is what we'll call the warning against popularization. And I think that this warning kind of stems from, or he included it because of a basic recognition, right? And that recognition is that this is a difficult book. Kant knows it. He knows he's a complicated writer. He knows that he makes things a little bit difficult sometimes. And it is. It's a very difficult book. It's not easy. It's not light reading. This is not Harry Potter. You can't pick this up and zip through it in an hour. It requires intense study if you are to understand it, right? So a common complaint in regard to difficult texts like this one often run as follows. Why couldn't this be easier and more straightforward? Why doesn't he just write in normal English? Well, I mean, of course, he doesn't write in English at all. He wrote this in German, and it's been translated. And I can tell you the German is far more difficult than the English is, so be grateful for small mercies. But this is a common complaint when it comes to difficult subject matter. Why didn't they make this easier? But this is really a deeply misguided criticism. Right? This is a bad critique to make. It's lazy, is what it really comes down to. We should not attempt to make morality popular or even practically useful prior to looking at the foundations our moral practices are built upon. Right? To ask for popularity and ease before doing hard work is like asking to eat the vegetables from your garden before you've planted them. Right? If someone says, that's so much work to plant a garden, why can't I just have the vegetables now? Well, you just answered your own question, because that's not how things work. You first have to plant the seeds, water them, and care for them. Later on, you get the fruits of your results. So I have here an image of Grimm's fairy tales, right? And in these fairy tales, as in most fairy tales or fables or popular books, there are moral lessons contained. Everywhere we find moral lessons. Moral lessons are in movies and plays and novels and short stories and poems. Moral lessons are all around us. So for someone to say, why couldn't Kant have written something simple like this? The answer is because, right? Simple writing doesn't answer complex questions. So we have to first determine what is right and why before we can prescribe right actions, let alone popularly prescribe them. Right, so there's an important distinction between pure and applied morality, as first discussed in the preface, right? Pure versus material, formal versus material. We must know the pure before attempting the applied. Something like Grimm's fairy tales contains very applied lessons, right? Here's a specific lesson about why it's important to, I don't know, leave a trail of breadcrumbs, or listen to your parents, or avoid being selfish, right? But we can only know those things are correct if we've actually done the hard work of looking at morality in a philosophical way. It's just, again, like engineering and mathematics. We cannot give sound advice on how to build a bridge, which is a practical application of knowledge, until we know the mathematics that underlies the rules of good engineering, which is, of course, why all you engineering majors have so many math classes. If someone were to say, I don't want to do the math, it's hard, why can't I just go build the bridge? Well, we would laugh at such a person and say, you're obviously not cut out to be either a mathematician or an engineer. You can't simply say, I want to do the fun, popular stuff before I do the hard work. We have to do the hard work first. Thus, quote, all moral concepts have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason, just as the practical applicable truths of engineering have their seat in pure mathematics. So this popularization warning is simply to point out, look, don't make the mistake of thinking that it's easy to do moral philosophy. We don't think that about the sciences. We don't think that about mathematics. We all recognize they're hard. For someone to say, oh no, philosophy's easy, you can just do it like that, snap your fingers and it's done. Well, that's ridiculous. If it was that easy, these questions would have been answered to everyone's satisfaction a long time ago. These questions are not easier than scientific and mathematical questions. They are more difficult, and they require more careful thought and consideration. So we should not expect Kant to have written something that is easy to read as a cookbook and to have given us these deep insights that he gives us. Deep insights come from hard work. So to sum up these warnings, I'd like to examine a concept called, or we might call, moral complacency. So the 2 or maybe 2.5 arguments just considered constitute, as I've said, moral warnings. We will call the first the moral self-opacity warning, and we'll kind of include the warning about examples in this one. And we'll call the second one the popularization warning. Both of these warnings serve to caution us against moral complacency. The first, by reminding us that we don't have direct access to our own motivations and intentions. And the second, that morality is not a children's game that is easy to learn and easy to do. So this word complacency, to be complacent is to be smugly and uncritically satisfied with oneself. I'm good enough already. I've already got this figured out. I'm sort of, coasting. I'm taking it easy here. This is complacency. But I think if we reflect on it, we immediately see that in any endeavor that we truly care about, complacency is a really disastrous attitude to have, such as pursuing a romantic interest. If you're really interested in someone romantically and you think, hey, I think there's a future in this relationship, well, there's probably no quicker way to ending that relationship prematurely than by being complacent about it. Yeah, I'll call you Saturday, and you don't, right? Yeah, we should go out, and you don't show up. That's not a recipe for a successful courtship. If you want to have a good romance or a good relationship with someone, you can't be complacent. Working towards a degree, the same thing. If you're complacent about your classes, well, we know what happens, right? It tends to not end that well. Succeeding in a career. Yeah, sure, boss, I'll show up, and you don't, right? That's not the way to get promotions. Maintaining healthy relationships, right? Not just starting them, but maintaining them. Playing sports, right? I think this is a kind of a helpful one, playing sports. For someone who's an athlete, a devoted athlete, there's nothing more dangerous than resting on one's laurels, right? As the expression goes. Now, the expression comes from the nature of the Olympic prizes given in ancient Greece. When you won an event in the ancient Olympic Games, there was no cash prize. You didn't get a gold medal even. What you got was simply a simple wreath of laurel leaves that you would weave through your hair. And that was just an emblem, a symbol of the real prize, which was victory. Right? You have defeated other able contestants. You have defeated other good athletes. And the honor and the glory of that victory is what you fight for, what you compete for. So resting on one's laurels is this kind of sports analogy, a sports term for someone who doesn't continue to push, doesn't continue to improve, but instead sits back and says, well, I got a gold medal, I'm going to take it easy now, right? Now, that's fine if you want to retire from the sport. I won my gold medal, that's all I wanted to do, I'm done. But if you want to keep being an athlete, no one ever says, no true athlete who's still trying to improve ever says, that was fast enough, that was good enough, that was enough points. No, it's always, okay, now I have to run faster. Now I have to go further. Now I have to score more points. Now we have to have a better season. Now I have to repeat this, get another championship. If we stop trying to improve, then we generally tend to regress. So moral complacency would thus be this type of attitude in relation to our own good deeds and to our own moral character. So it might look like this, right? I did a good deed this morning. Surely I can take the rest of the day off and just kind of do as I please, right? I did something nice. Now I can, go ahead and pirate that song. I was kind to somebody, so I think I'll tell this lie, right? To have such an attitude is an unmitigated disaster, right? To give ourselves a pass when it comes to morality is a terrible thing to do. If the above pursuits, romantic interest, degrees, careers, or whatever, if those pursuits matter enough to caution us against complacency, and they certainly do, then shouldn't we be cautious about moral complacency even more? Perhaps far more, right? Doesn't it matter far more at the end of the day that we be a good person than that we be a good basketball player or that we get a promotion, right? And of course, a lot of these above things, the maintenance of healthy relationships, right, in particular, require good moral behavior in the first place. So morality is certainly more important than any of these other goals. Hence, moral complacency is a very large danger. So Kant's point with these warnings is to warn us against thinking that we're good enough already. We don't know why we do what we do, not completely, right? And we shouldn't think that morality is some simple matter, easy to know, easy to do. We turn now to the main argument of section 2, which begins with this discussion that we'll call the discussion of the representation of laws. After giving these two warnings that we've just discussed, Kant now turns to the main task at hand, which is the elucidation of the foundational principle of morality. Kant writes, quote, "Everything in nature works according to laws. Only a rational being has the capacity to act according to the representation of laws. That is, according to principles or a will." So what does he mean by this? Well, let's start with the first short sentence, that everything in nature works according to laws. The physical world, or to say the same thing, nature, operates according to laws, which we might broadly define as necessitating conditions that make things behave the way that they do. So, basic example, here's a phenomenon. Unsupported physical objects fall to the ground. What law explains this? Well, it's the law that Isaac Newton formulated and that we call the law of universal gravitation. That's why objects fall to the ground. That's why the apple in the famous story, Newton is thinking in his orchard. The apple didn't fall on his head. That's a fancification. He just watched it fall from a distance. And that was the kind of occasion or experience that led him to discovering and mathematizing this law. Now, I don't want to get too deep into what natural laws are. It's a very sticky and difficult philosophical issue to define exactly what natural laws are. But the general point that Kant's referring to here or making here is relatively simple. And that is that things happen in the natural world according to fixed and immutable laws or patterns, right? So if you see an avalanche making its way down a mountain, a bunch of snow is cascading down a mountain, you don't think to yourself like, I wonder why the mountain chose to do that. Well, no, it didn't choose anything. Certain events were at play, right? Wind struck the mountain, or there was a loud noise, or a pebble slid down from up above, and it started the avalanche, right? Natural laws dictate or define or explain how and why these things happen. Beings with reason and will, however, are different than this. Rational beings, Kant says, alone can act according to the representation of laws. So as we said, we don't ask, I wonder why the mountain did that. I wonder why it chose that, because mountains don't choose. However, when a person does something, right, you say, I wonder why she chose to do that. I wonder why he did that, right? We do wonder about that. And this capacity to act outside of the mere constraint of natural or physical law, Kant is here referring to as the capacity to act according to the representation of laws. So what does this mean? Well, first off, what is a representation? Well, a simple example would be a painting, something that represents or images something else. Here's a picture of the face of Venus from Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Now, of course, this isn't Venus, it's a representation of Venus. Now, of course, Venus doesn't exist as an actual deity or an actual being. She's a mythological creature. So we can also look at the painting right above, and there we have a representation of Isaac Newton. Is that Isaac Newton? Well, if I ask, is that Isaac Newton, the question can be answered in one of two ways. One way to answer it would be to say, yes, it is. Another way would be to say, no, it isn't. It is Isaac Newton in one sense, in that it's an image of him or a representation of him. But of course, that picture right there in this PowerPoint, that is not Isaac Newton. You can't talk to it. It doesn't have, it wasn't born in England. It didn't discover the law of gravitation. So it's an image, a representation of Newton, just as this is a representation of Venus. More generally, representation here means the ability to conceptualize something or to form it in thought, to present itself, to present it to ourselves and others, right? So it's the capacity to give an image of something, a concept of something, and to present it to either our own mind or the mind of another. Thus, it would seem the ability to act according to the representation of laws is the capacity to direct ourselves through rational intention and choice, right? To say, here's the way things are going, and here's what I'm going to do as a result. So for instance, suppose I'm in an apple orchard and I see an apple fall to the ground. I think to myself, just as Newton said, that apple fell through, the force of gravitation. I think I will walk over there and pick it up and eat it, right? I am intending a certain thing, right? I am sort of knowing what I know about the nature of the world. I am giving myself a certain task, a certain goal, namely of eating the apple. And so I move my legs, I go over, I pick it up, and I eat it. So the representation of laws is something that only, to act according to these representations is something that only a rational being with reason and will can do. The will is practical reason. Kant continues, quote, "Since reason is required for deriving actions from laws, the will is nothing other than practical reason." So here when we say the will, we're talking about, kind of the center of your choice, right? The center of your active personality, what you will, what you choose, what you do. And Kant is here saying that the human will, or a rational will, is nothing other than practical reason. What does that mean? Well, first off, what is reason? Reason, in its theoretical sense, is the overarching capacity for principled, systematic cognition of reality. Systematic, principled thought, right? It is reason that allows us to interpret and unify our various experiences and concepts and to order them according to universal principles, right? So when Newton saw that apple falling down, he began to reason about it. He began to think, I wonder what caused that. I wonder what ultimate states of affairs in the world are responsible for objects falling downward rather than going sideways or flying upward, right? Reason, right, whereby he takes a whole bunch of different sense data, collates it together into a sort of working theory, and presents a particular law here. Now, of course, that's a very lofty example here of someone deducing a fundamental law of the physical world, but we all use reason every single day in all sorts of ways. If you get home from work and your roommate's in a bad mood, you try to, but they don't want to talk about it, you try to reason your way out to what might be going on. You're thinking abstractly. That's what reason is. Practical reason, however, is distinct from theoretical reason. Where theoretical reason, which is concerned with knowledge and the cognition of the elements of our experience, practical reason, by contrast, is concerned with bringing objects and states of affairs into being, i.e. with realizing them, right? Making them real, hence the hyphen in realizing. So an example, theoretical reason seeks to find an explanation for what overarching system of laws dictates the ebb and swell of the tides and the currents of the oceans in accordance with overarching principles, right? Theoretical reason seeks to understand how the oceans work. Practical reason may seek to, say, build a vessel shaped in accordance with those principles, capable of navigating those waves and thus reaching distant lands. So you see the distinction here. Theoretical reason simply wants to understand. Practical reason wants to use, wants to make something out of it. As Kant notes, reason is, quote, required for deriving actions from laws. So to build a ship, we must be able to reason our way to this or that action in relation to the laws we recognize. If I recognize that the oceans work according to the nature of the trade winds, the cycles of the moon, well, then I have to conform my actions to those reasons, to those laws. Once I understand certain things about the ocean, such as, say, the principle of buoyancy, then I'm not going to make my ship out of titanium, right? I'm not going to make my ship out of lead. A lead ship will sink, right? Titanium might be a bad example because it's fairly light, and I'm sure that a lot of those big, cruise liners are partly built out of things like titanium, but no ship could be built out of lead, right? It's simply too heavy. So once I know something about the principles of buoyancy, I say, well, lead's out, right? And I need reason to do that, reason to pick out a particular action from my recognition of the laws that dictate or govern the ocean. Excuse me, since rational beings are unique in their capacity to act according to the representation of laws, i.e. through a will, we thus see that the will is simply practical reason as such. So, to summarize, we cognitively grasp the nature of the world theoretically, then we act within it practically. So our will is just the same thing as practical reason. When you will to do something, for instance, you will to go and help a friend of yours move from their old apartment to their new one, what you're doing is practically reasoning your way to action. And that's what the will is, it's practical reason. So let's now consider two potential types of rational being. We've seen that rational beings are unique in the world because unlike, rocks and mountains and trees and bushes, things don't simply happen to us. We are practically rational and we do things, right? We represent laws, and thus we set into event new chains of being. Now, of course, animals set things into event too, but animals do this on the basis of instinct, on the basis of stimulus response, at least as far as we can tell. Certainly, lower order animals do. Human beings seem to be fairly unique in their capacity to act on the basis of reason. So the will is nothing other than practical reason, as we've seen, i.e. the capacity to realize actions in the world through the derivation of particular actions from a consideration of general laws. A derivation is to derive something, right? So I say, since I know that this is how buoyancy works, I will build my boat out of pine, whatever. Right? Or here's another example. I feel a variety of sensations, lightheadedness, a parched throat, dry lips. I unify these sensations together in a judgment. I am thirsty. Recognizing this fact theoretically, I now will to set into motion a chain of events leading me to get a glass of water. I stand up from my desk chair, I walk into the kitchen, I grab a glass, I fill it up, I drink it, right? So this is what we do. We derive particular actions from a consideration of general laws. Now let's consider two types of possible rational beings. The first is a being in whom reason determines the will without fail, right? A being in whom reason perfectly determines the will. Such a being would always act rationally. They would be a perfectly rational being. Kant clearly has God in mind here. Now, a note about Kant on God. Kant almost certainly believed in God in some form. Kant has a very vexed relation. He was raised, again, in a traditional Lutheran pietist household, and he seems to maintain some type of belief in God throughout his life, most if not all of his life. But he does not utilize God as a central concept or notion in his moral system, right? God is not really going to be doing any or very much central work in his moral system. Now, there's a place for God within it, and he does think that moral arguments show us that there must be a God. But it's very crucial that we keep in mind that on Kant's view, the moral law is not something created by God. And in order to be moral, we don't have to set out to please God. God stands under and is determined and dictated by the moral law just like the rest of us on Kant's view. Now, God is different from us in the sense that God is totally perfect and completely rational, and hence God would always follow the moral law without fail. So when he brings in God here as a kind of idea, and throughout the book for that matter, he's really generally doing it as a means of clarifying this or that argument. Here the notion of God is brought in as a theoretical contrast to human nature. So to really get clear on Kant's views on God would take far more time and space than we have right now. Suffice it to say, God is not playing an incredibly central role here the way it would be in a Christian or Jewish or Hindu ethic. So that's the first type of being, a perfectly rational being, such as, say, God or angels, right? The second type of being is a being in whom reason does not perfectly determine the will, but in whom various subjective desires often conflict with the demands of reason. And Kant clearly has human beings in mind here, right? Are we beings, we have reason, we're rational beings, but do we always act rationally? No, of course not. Does reason always perfectly determine our actions? No, of course not. So, we are a different type of being. We are a being of the second type here, a being in whom reason is present, but does not perfectly determine our actions. So, what does this mean? What's the point of this little thought? Well, I think the first point to make is that human beings are curious creatures. We are, as we might put it, psychologically disunified. We are not unified with ourselves psychologically. Very often we do things that we know are wrong, whether morally wrong or simply imprudent, right? Oftentimes we do things that we don't even really want to do. Right? We do things all the time and then later on say, man, I wish I had not done that, right? That was stupid. And even at the time we say, I know I shouldn't, but here we go. I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it, right? So take an example. Suppose you have an important test tomorrow that you have not studied for and you're not at all prepared for. You care about the class and you really want to succeed. Maybe you even need to succeed, right? You have to get a good grade in this class or you lose your scholarship or something, right? Or, you shoot your GPA, or, whatever, something bad happens. You don't, you want to do well in this class, but then a friend calls you and invites you to a party. Knowing that you shouldn't go, you go anyway. It's a common story. I've certainly been there. Now, we know that such actions are wrong, or at the very least, in this case, perhaps foolish. I don't know if there's anything morally wrong about going to this party, but it's certainly foolish. You know you have to study. You know you need to do well. Why'd you go to the party, right? We just do it. How is this possible? Now, of course, we know that it happens because we're humans and we see what we do and we see what others do. And we know that everybody acts this way from time to time, or perhaps fairly frequently. But the question we're asking is, how is it possible that you could do something that you don't really want to do, that you know is wrong, that you know is foolish? Well, this is a common theme of human nature, right? There are two very famous and paradigmatic statements of this flaw in human nature in the Christian New Testament, right? Just a good historical example of this type of recognition. The first very famous expression was uttered by Jesus when his disciples could not stay awake with him in the hours leading up to his death. Jesus says, and a quote I know you've heard, right? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Right, that's what's going on here. Your spirit is willing, your mind is willing to study for this test, but studying for tests is boring, and going to parties is exciting. So the flesh is weak. The desire for excitement overrules the far less exciting, but far more necessary study time. The second comes from St. Paul in his epistle to the Romans. He says, "What I do not understand. For I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate." Right? We do things even though they're hateful to us. We do things knowing they're wrong. We do things and then we are upset with ourselves. We are guilty. We say, I did it again. I made the same mistake again. Why did I do that? The Greek term for this phenomenon, or at least one version of this phenomenon, or one aspect of this phenomenon, is akrasia, which means weakness of will, or perhaps acting against one's better judgment. To use St. Paul's language, doing what we hate. And I'm quite confident this is a phenomenon that everyone has some familiarity with. We've all done this. Now, to return to Kant's language, we are beings in whom reason does not perfectly determine the will. We're that second type of being on the previous slide. In other words, we often act against reason. We act against the dictates of reason. Or more simply, we act irrationally. Why? Why do we act irrationally? If it's irrational, then why don't we just not do it? Why don't we act rationally? A perfect being, a being in whom reason perfectly determines the will, would always act rationally. For instance, God, there's no temptation for, if God exists, there's no temptation for God to sin, right? Because God is perfectly rational. God wouldn't sin. It's just not that God has to control himself. There's no desire there. There's nothing that would motivate God to act irrationally. So why do we? No one acts for no reason at all, right? Something must have motivated the action, and of course something did. In such cases, something motivates us that is not present at all in a being whom reason perfectly determines, right? What motivates us in such cases is inclinations and pathological desires, right? Obviously. Why didn't you study? Why did you go to the party? Well, because you wanted to, because you thought it would be more fun, because it's not that exciting to study, and it is exciting to go to a party. In short, we do not violate reason for any good reason, right? We violate reason because we want something, and reason is in the way. Reason says, hey, you ought to stay and study, and I say, I know I should, but shut up, reason. I want to go to the party. I want to do what I want to do, even if it's irrational. So weakness of will, this akrasia, this sort of incapacity to do what we know we should, it can manifest itself in relatively trivial matters, such as, say, cheating on a diet because one wants a second slice of cake. This is a very common thing. We set ourselves a goal that we really want, and then we break it. It's absurd. Someone says, I really want to lose weight, or I really want to get into good shape so I can run a marathon. And since that's my goal, I'm going to cut out sugar. No more dessert, right? I can't eat desserts anymore, can't eat carbs, whatever it might be. And then they cheat every day, right? And I've been there, right? You want something, But then in the moment, it becomes difficult to carry through on this long-term and difficult goal of losing weight or getting fit or whatever it might be, getting a good grade in the class, whatever, because in the moment, something else comes along that promises a quicker reward. It's a very long-term goal to get into shape. It's a very short-term goal to enjoy a piece of cake. It takes many months to get into shape, if not years. It takes 2 minutes to eat a piece of cake, right? It's easy, it's quick. Or weakness of will can manifest in hugely morally significant situations, such as murdering someone because they have something that you want, right? Here's Cain killing Abel. Why do people kill people? They know it's wrong, at least cognitively. Well, generally it's because they are overcome by some emotion, such as hatred or jealousy, or because killing them can, net them a lot of money, can get them a position. This is why people do these things, because they want something, right? So these two actions, cheating on a diet versus murdering someone, are obviously worlds apart. The first, cheating on your diet, is not an immoral action. It's not immoral to cheat on your diet because there are no rational moral laws that hold that you shouldn't have a second piece of cake or that you should follow your diet. But it's still puzzling as to why you would do it, since you really don't want to do it overall, and we kick ourselves the next day. So the first action, right, cheating on a diet or whatever, it's simply imprudent or foolish, but not immoral. Whereas the second action, murdering someone, is obviously immoral. Both actions, however, share the same basic psychological structure, and that is the structure or the phenomenon, I suppose, of desire running roughshod over reason, right? Yeah, I know that in order to succeed on my diet, I shouldn't have the cake, but I don't care because I want it, right? I know that, in order to be a good person, I shouldn't tell this lie, but I don't care. I want to tell the lie. So it might be helpful to return to this graphic that we saw in the previous PowerPoint, the will at the crossroads. This is what's going on here in cases of weakness of will. This is what it is to be a human being. It's to have these twin sources of motivation, right? We are always being pushed and pulled in two different directions at once. On the one hand, the right side of the equation here, and the far more noisy side, we have these a posteriori objects of inclination, right? These material things, these things that we happen to desire as human beings, and furthermore as particular human beings. So we desire things again like honor, money, power, fame, pleasure, and all of the particular things that go under those headings. These are things that we want, and we often want them incredibly powerfully, so much so that we completely ignore what we know we ought to do in order to attain them. And on the other hand, the much quieter but more powerful at the end of the day voice comes from the moral law, the a priori principle, the formal law of the will. Recall back to the preface, the form and essence of a good will, which is not, getting some particular, lump of cash or the approbation of one's fellows or a bit of pleasure or, a seat in the Senate or a tour as a rock star, right? All of those things might be desirable, but none of them constitutes moral worth. Someone being famous is not the same as someone being moral. Someone being rich is not the same as someone being moral, right? And when there's a conflict in our wills, it's a conflict generally between these two sources. Conflicts, of course, can also occur. There's a lot of infighting on the right side here. Sometimes our desire for honor gets in the way of our desire for money, and so on and so forth. But when there is a moral question here, right, ultimately it comes down to us not following the moral law and instead giving into objects of desire. So we're beings in whom reason does not perfectly determine the will, because we have all these subjective propensities and inclinations that are always bugging us to give them what they want. So I have an image here of two Russian hussars or knights sort of jousting, right? And we can think about reason and inclination as being locked in this type of a battle. It's a moral struggle. What is moral struggle over? Well, typically it's over this. It's over knowing what I should do, but wanting to do something else. Inclination, or in other words, desire, or as Kant will often put it, the demands of the dear self, right? I love myself so much. I want me to have good things. And if I have to lie and cheat and steal to get it, maybe I will. That's what the dear self says, right? You know what you want, go get it, even though you know you shouldn't. So this is the struggle. This is the moral struggle, is overcoming inclination in order to do what we know to be right. As we all know, this is easier said than done, right? It's one thing to say, well, I should do what's right. Yeah, I should, of course, I should. Everyone knows that. Um, the problem isn't a cognitive one. The problem is a desirous one. The problem is a pathological one. We know what to do often, if not most of the time, but we don't do it. We habitually fail to live up to what we ought to do. And again, sometimes this is in a morally charged situation, such as should I be honest or not? And sometimes it's merely a prudential situation. Should I study for the test or not? So the question that we have to ask as the sorts of beings that we are, which is beings of reason, but also beings of emotion and desire, the question is, well, how can we follow reason? How do I do what reason tells me to do? I try, but I seem to fail. So how do I do this? What does it mean to follow reason, and how is it possible? Well, the answer is by formulating and following imperatives of reason. Since we don't simply do what we ought to do by nature, we have to give imperatives. Now, an imperative is a command. If you've studied a language, you've studied probably the imperative form. And an imperative form in a language is the command form. So if I say to someone, stand up, right, that's an imperative. Sit down, that's an imperative. Wash your hands. These are all commands. They are utterances designed to get someone else or ourselves to do something. So God, or a perfect rational being, would not need imperatives. It would be ridiculous for someone to say to a perfectly rational being, you should be honest, or you should do what you said you would do. Such a being would say, well, what do you mean I should? How could I avoid it? It's what I should do. It's what I'll do. It would be as nonsensical as me saying to one of you, you should obey the law of gravity. You really should start obeying that. You'd say, what do you mean I should obey it? I have to obey it. Nothing I can possibly do would ever break it. So I have to obey it, right? So imperatives don't have any force for a perfect rational being, such as God or an angel or whatever, but they have a lot of force for us, imperfect rational beings, beings in whom reason does not perfectly direct the will. The first type of imperative that Kant considers is what he calls hypothetical imperatives. So these hypothetical imperatives we might also call possible commands. Hypothetical here means possible. It's a hypothetical, right? It's not necessary, it's hypothetical. So this is a possible command that one might give. Such imperatives command only provisionally or hypothetically based upon some object or outcome that one happens to desire. So, for instance, if you want to become a good runner, say you want to become a long distance runner, or you want to become a tightrope walker, or perhaps you want to, say, build a birdhouse, right? I'm just picking three random examples here. Obviously, we could pick anything, right? You want to, you rebuild old cars, you want to get A's in all your classes, doesn't matter. Any particular thing you might happen to desire. There are rules or commands that you must follow in order to succeed in these activities. Not just any effort will result in becoming a tightrope walker. You must follow certain commands or imperatives that are made manifest by the nature of the activity, right? This is what practical reason is. You must deduce certain actions from a consideration of laws. If someone said, I want to be a tightrope walker, and I said, oh, well, you better start working on your balance then. They say, no, I'm not going to do that. I say, okay, well, I guess you don't want to become a tightrope walker then, because if you really want to become a tightrope walker, you need good balance. That's kind of the first thing you need, right? So we have to follow these rules or commands in order to bring about these states of affairs. This is why in sports, people need coaches. And this is why in matters of education, people need teachers, because they don't yet know how to do these things. Others have to tell them, here's what you have to do. So first example, Tom is a ski instructor. He tells his student, say Tori, who's an aspiring skier, you should, right, imperative, you should work on your left turns. He has given her an imperative. Is she bound to follow it? Must she follow it? Well, only if she happens to want to be a good skier, right? The imperative only has force because of what Tori already desires. Just sort of spoiler alert, looking ahead a little bit as to what Kant is after here, right? He's defined the human person as a being of reason and will, in whom also exist various inclinations and desires. These inclinations and desires often get in the way of us doing things that we know we should do, right? So the question that he's asking here, and not just in this section, but in the whole book, the general question Kant is asking is, what should I do? Ethics is about asking, what should I do? How should I behave? And recall that he's looking for the foundation of ethics. Is there anything pure and formal that has to have effect within my will? Are there any absolute moral commands that I must do and other absolute moral commands that I must, or other things that I must absolutely avoid, right? So hypothetical imperatives are particular commands designed to bring about a particular end. So if, for instance, we took this claim, you should work on your left turns, and we tried to ask, is that a moral imperative, right? Is it a moral imperative that everyone should work on their left turns, right? Just think about that for a second, and we'll come back to that question. Example 2, I tell my students, you must hand in your papers by next Friday. Well, I've given them an imperative. Must they obey it? Well, again, only if they want a good grade. Again, the imperative has effect because and only to the extent that the students want a passing grade. In other words, the force of these commands in their effect upon the will rests entirely upon the desires that this or that person happens to have. It's even the same way with laws of the state. The state says you must not steal from other citizens. Now, is that an absolute command? Well, if you don't want to go to jail, right? But of course, once again, if someone says, well, I'm okay with jail, right? Okay, well, then it looks like that command, at least as a political command, only has hypothetical force for them because they don't really care about jail. It would be an odd person, right? But it's not, not inconceivable. The force of the command rests upon the recognition that doing this will get you what you want, or in the case of a prohibition, doing this will cause you pain. But obviously, to go back to my question of a moment ago, right? You should work on your left turns. Is that a moral command? Is that a command that everyone must follow in order to be good? No, of course not, right? There's no moral imperative to be a good skier. There's no moral imperative to ski at all, right? If someone says, I don't care about skiing, I don't say, well, you're a moral monster then and you disgust me, right? No, I don't care. I mean, it doesn't matter. And not only don't I care, reason doesn't care. You don't have to ski to be a good person, and there's no connection at all between skiing and not skiing and being good or bad, right? You could be a bad person who skis or a good person who doesn't ski. There's no connection at all. So this means that no merely hypothetical command can be a universal command of reason applicable equally to everyone. Thus, as we will see, no merely hypothetical imperative is fit to be a moral command. And this, of course, links right back up with what we saw in the preface in section 1. What we're looking for is something that holds true universally, right? A moral foundation that is pure and formal, not applied and empirical. But skiing is an empirical activity. It's a physical activity. And there's no moral imperative that anyone ought to ski or ought not to ski. So if I say you should work on your left turns, that's a very narrow sort of command, and it only holds true. I mean, this is a narrow enough command that really here it only holds true for Tory or for other people who are in a very similar situation who are working on turning on the mountain better to their left, right? Generally, people favor one leg or the other. And Tory apparently is weak on her left side, so that's what she needs to work on. And that command holds for her and for anyone else, I suppose, who happens to have the exact same problem. But for everyone else, it doesn't hold. A professional skier doesn't need to heed that advice because their left turns are already perfect, right? And someone who has no interest in skiing doesn't have to work on that, doesn't have to heed it because, if you don't care about skiing, then you don't care about left turns while skiing. We're going to get a little bit deeper here into the nature of these hypothetical imperatives. They can be further divided into first, problematic or possible imperatives, and second, assertoric or actual imperatives. And again, just so we don't lose the thread here, right, the thread of what Kant's doing, it's easy to get lost in the details here. All he's really doing here is asking, what should I do? How do I direct my will? Since I have reason, but I don't perfectly, follow it, we need to ask what sorts of commands do we have to be giving? If we were rational by nature and simply rational by nature, like God or an angel, there'd be no need to do moral philosophy in the first place. we would automatically do what was right. Since we don't automatically do what's right, we have to start thinking about what commands we need to give and on what basis, right? What sorts of commands are moral commands and what sorts of commands aren't morally significant, right? Obviously, you should work on your left turns. It's a command, but it's not a morally significant command. It's a morally insignificant command. Now, problematic hypothetical imperatives are based upon any possible but not necessarily actual object of desire. So an example would be, say, becoming a good martial artist, or all the examples I just gave: skiing, running, tightrope walking, birdhouse building, etc. So problematic hypothetical imperatives are the ones we were just considering. We're just now giving them a name. Such commands are called, or issue in, rules of skill. So for instance, Tori, who needs to work on her left turns, she is told by a coach or an instructor, here's the rule of skill you need to work on. Here's what you need to do in order to improve at your chosen task. So again, if you go to a carpentry school, you will learn various rules of skill for building good birdhouses or decks or regular houses or whatever, right? So much then for these problematic hypothetical imperatives. These are just things that we might happen to desire and the specific rules that will lead us there. Assertoric hypothetical imperatives are based upon the one actual desire that all human beings in fact share, and that of course is the desire for happiness. Does everyone want to be a good skier? No. Does everyone want to be a good martial artist? No, but everyone wants to be happy. Unfortunately, while everyone desires happiness, it is not easy at all to determine what we should do in order to become happy. It's not nearly as easy to determine how to become happy as it is to determine how to build a birdhouse. Happiness is an indeterminate concept of the imagination, Kant says, that we cannot with any certainty prescribe absolute rules for. To see Kant's point here, imagine two different scenarios. In the first, an acquaintance of yours approaches you and asks for advice on how to build a custom gaming PC. Let's suppose you know a lot about this. You built many custom gaming PCs for yourself and help some friends to do it as well. So you give them the rundown on things they need to do. You need to get yourself a tower or a case. You need to get you need to pick a PC, a CPU and a motherboard. You need to buy these fans, so on and so forth. You give them the rundown. Here's what you need to do to build a gaming PC. It's easy, right? It's easy to do. Now, there's a lot of options within building a PC or building a birdhouse or whatever, but the rules are easy enough to give. It's not that complicated to say what you need to do to build a PC. It's pretty simple. But now suppose a different acquaintance approaches you and says, I'm not happy. I'm miserable. I'm not happy at all. What should I do to be happy? Well, what do you say to this person? This is a much harder question than how do I build a PC, right? And again, to see why, if you don't know how to build a PC, you can go to Google and say, how do I build a PC? And you can find hundreds or even thousands of tutorials, walkthroughs, videos showing you everything you need to do to build a PC. If you don't know how to do martial arts, you can go to a dojo and you can say, hey, how do I do martial arts? And they say, I'll teach you for this amount of money. But if you Google, how do I be happy, right? The advice you're going to get is going to be as varied as there are creatures under the sun. What is happiness? Unclear. How do I get it? Unclear. It's not clear what happiness even is, let alone how we achieve it. This is why there's no shortage of self-help gurus willing to sell you happiness plans for your hard-earned money. It's difficult to know how to be happy, and it might even be impossible. Happiness is such an indeterminate concept that we can't really know what to do. Now, we can give general counsels, we can give general advice, right? But there's not a simple set of rules or imperatives to follow. I mean, the first thing I would say to such a person, and I've had people ask me this question before, and it's always a difficult question to hear, right? Because it's difficult to hear that people are suffering. But the first thing I always do, and I think the first thing most people would do, is say, well, tell me about yourself. Tell me what you think you're missing. Tell me what makes you happy, right? I need to know more about you. That kind of indicates that the answer here is not clear cut at all. If someone comes to me and says, how do I build a PC? I don't say, well, tell me about yourself. Tell me about your history. What makes you happy? I mean, I might say, tell me about your preferences when it comes to size of computer, but I don't need their life story in order to know how to build them a PC. In order to help somebody be happy, right, to the small extent I might be able to help, I do need to know their life story, right? I would need to know a lot about them. So in the case of both of these types of commands, problematic and assertoric hypothetical imperatives, we have only provisional commands of the form, if you want X, do Y. If you want a computer, buy these parts, right? If you want to build a birdhouse, buy this type of wood. And we have the same structured form when it comes to imperatives of happiness. They're just a lot more indeterminate, right? So if someone says, I'm not happy, I say, well, if you want happiness, you should, make friends. You should find a career you enjoy. Are those things guaranteed to succeed? No, they're not. That's where they're different here, right? There's no guarantee of success when it comes to these hypothetical assertoric imperatives, these imperatives of happiness. Whereas there pretty much is a guarantee of success. If you put this CPU in this motherboard, it will work, right? Happiness isn't the same way, but the general structure here is the same, and it's a hypothetical structure. If you want X, then do Y. So hypothetical imperatives thus issue merely hypothetical commands for this or that will. Recall that Kant's overall aim and goal in this book is to investigate morality in its pure and formal foundations. This is why it has to be cleansed of anthropology. Once we have all these desires, these material desires kicking around, our true obligations become unclear because they get mixed up with what we happen to want. So what we're trying to do is say, set all that aside. Again, anthropology is not bad, desire is not bad. Just set it aside for the moment and ask a basic question. Is there anything I simply must do? Is there anything I must do as a rational being? Well, any merely hypothetical command, such as, well, work on your left turns while skiing, or build a birdhouse. No, that only has its force for this or that individual, or this or that type of being, and thus it can't be called a moral command. What Kant is now considering, and this is the heart of the work, right, this is the heart of the book, is whether or not there are any absolute commands for the will, whose legislative force is not derived from that being's desires, but is rather universal and necessary, a universal and necessary command for will as such, i.e. a necessary command of practical reason, one that would hold not only for me, not only for you, not only for human beings, but for all rational beings, for God, for angels, for intelligent life on other planets if there is any, right? And of course for us. Such a command, if it exists, would be called a categorical imperative. This phrase, the categorical imperative, is the most famous phrase in Kant's lexicon. If you were to say to someone, oh, I'm studying Kant right now in my ethics class, and they had studied them, chances are they'll remember this phrase. They might say, oh, you mean the categorical imperative guy, right? This is the heart of the view. This is the categorical imperative is what is going to finally answer the question for us of what a good will is. So, think to Mill, if the heart of Mill's view is the GHP, the heart of Kant's view is the categorical imperative. This is the phrase to hone in on and define. And it is this, quote, there is therefore only a single categorical imperative, and it is this. Act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Now, of course, we've already seen this. We saw it at the end of section 1. Recall the structure methodologically of these two sections. The first section started from common concepts and says, why do we think we have these duties? What are these duties, right? Well, it looks like maybe these duties result or boil down to the simple recognition that I ought to act in such a way that everyone else can act that way. I ought to behave rationally. I ought to behave fairly, right? I shouldn't tell lies because it's impossible to universalize that. If everyone lied, my lie would fail, right? That this is the core we discovered at the end of section 1, and it now turns out to be the supreme practical principle of the will, that a will has to follow in order to be judged to be a good will. So all this stuff about hypothetical imperatives, that was just kind of clearing the ground, getting all of these pseudo imperatives out of the way so that we could identify the supreme practical principle of the will, which is the categorical imperative. So, to contrast, the general form of a hypothetical imperative is, if you want X, do Y. If you want to get good at skiing, work on your turns. If you want to be a good runner, build up your endurance. All of those commands command only provisionally, only hypothetically, and they thus are not good candidates for being moral laws. By contrast, the form of a categorical imperative, to use this same type of structure, would be simply do Y. Do this. You must do this. I don't care what you want, this is what you must do. You must act such that the maxim of your action can stand as a universal law. That is your duty as a rational being. Before anything else, you must make sure that you are doing that. So let's briefly take an overview of these three classes of imperatives. There's a lot of different distinctions here. As Kant himself noted, this is a hard book, and I'm aware that it's difficult. He's carving these questions up in fairly complicated ways, so let's just do a quick overview and make sure we're on the same page. So first we had problematic hypothetical imperatives, which are possible commands that we might follow. Their goal or their object is anything, any possible object of desire, right? From a birdhouse to world domination, whatever someone might happen to desire. The type of command they give is a rule of skill or a set of such rules, whose form and nature is determined by the nature of the object sought. So examples might include, you should engage in physical training in order to be good at sports, or you should study hard in order to succeed in school, or you should use high quality wood in order to make a good table, or you should observe this diet in order to lose weight, etc. Now, of course, note, these problematic hypothetical imperatives, they're not bad. It's not bad to follow such rules. Of course, we all follow such rules every single day. If you want to fulfill a given goal, then you have to follow such rules. It's just that they have no moral significance really one way or the other as such. There could, of course, be bad ones, right? Such as if you want to dominate the world, build a lot of nukes or something. That would be morally problematic, right? But I don't want you to think that since these aren't categorical imperatives, they should be avoided. He's not saying anything like that, right? Of course, we all have to follow various hypothetical imperatives. It's just that this isn't where we find morality. Morality is found elsewhere. These hypothetical imperatives, these are the sort of day-to-day commands that we follow in order to get stuff done. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just that that's not where morality lives, as it were. Next, we had assertoric hypothetical imperatives, the object of which is happiness, as an object actually desired by all. So where these imperatives are different from the problematic is that we can suppose safely that everyone does desire happiness, whereas not everyone desires to be good at sports or to build a birdhouse or what have you. Everyone desires happiness. So the commands that it gives are provisional counsels of prudence that tend on the whole to produce happiness in those who follow them. Examples might include, you should make friends, you should get an education, right? You should raise a family, be engaged in your community, find meaningful work, cultivate interesting hobbies, etc. Now, are these all guarantees of happiness? No, none of them are. There is no guarantee of happiness in this life, and anyone who says there is selling you something. There's no guarantee that you'll be happy. There are simply general counsels that will tend on the whole for most people to produce happiness. But for some people, getting an education is not probably going to do much for them in terms of their happiness. For others, perhaps raising a family won't. For those who are sort of perpetual introverts, maybe being engaged in the community is painful and not really productive of happiness for them. So there's no absolute commands that we can give here. But even if there were, even if we did know exactly what made people happy, it still wouldn't result in a moral command, because it would still only be a particular material desire. It wouldn't be a formal rule that we had to follow as such. It would just be a way to bring about a desirable state of affairs or a desirable condition. Finally, we have the categorical imperative. Its object is nothing, right? There is no material object being sought here. Recall when Kant describes the good will, he says the good will is good not because of what it produces or brings about. It's good simply in itself. When I act morally, I'm precisely acting such that I'm not trying to bring anything about, right? If I was trying to bring anything about, then we would have, a hypothetical imperative. It's not like, oh, I can tell you're good because you made a lot of money. No, I mean, moral goodness has nothing to do with how much money you make. So there is no material object here. The object, if we can speak of it that way, is rather the form of a good will. The command, of course, is act only according to that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Examples of particular commands would be things like do not lie, do not steal, do not murder, cultivate your talents, help and respect others, etc. So these are the three types of imperatives that we have here. And it should just be immediately clear, right, that there's something very different about this last set. Take, for instance, do not murder. There's a command. And contrast it with the command, use high quality wood in order to make a good table. So I tell somebody, you really ought to use high quality wood and make tables, right? You should be a table maker. You should do that. And they say, and I'm not interested in carpentry, right? Now, that's a perfectly fair reply. They say, I'm not interested in carpentry. I say, oh, fair enough. That's not your thing. Okay, I understand. Don't worry about it. Right? You don't want to. There's no need for this or that person to be a carpenter. There's no moral imperative there. But if I say to someone, hey, you shouldn't murder, and they say, no, that's not my thing. I'm a murderer. I like murdering. I don't say, oh, okay, I get it. Murdering's your thing. Cool. Yeah, go for it, man. All right, see you around. No, murdering can't be your thing, right? You don't get to be that way. You can decide not to maybe be a carpenter, and there's no problem. But if you decide, no, I'm not going to be a truthful person, that's not my thing. No, that has to be your thing because it's everyone's thing. It must be. I don't care if you want to be honest or not, you must be honest. It is what morality demands of you. I don't care if you want to murder, you must not murder. It is wrong. It doesn't depend upon what you desire or what anyone desires. It does not depend upon desire. It depends upon reason. And reason determines and dictates that certain things simply must be done and other things must be avoided. Kant now asks a question. The question is, well, how is it possible to follow these imperatives? Since our wills are constituted by these two sources, reason on the one side and inclination on the other, how is it possible to follow them? Again, how do we carry them out? In other words, what is it that moves the will to follow this or that command, to follow such imperatives? Well, the first type, the problematic hypothetical imperatives, which aim at any possible object of desire and are expressed as rules of skill, this is easy to see, right? Kant says doing these is easy. It might be hard to carry it out, but knowing how to do it is easy. Insofar as we will the end, we also will the means to it. So the possibility of following such a command is obvious. So if someone comes to me and says, I want to build a table, I say, okay, here's a blueprint or here's a schematic, follow this. And they say, how do I do that though? I say, what are you talking about? How do you do it? Just do it. Buy the wood, put the nails there. What do you mean? Right? If you're building the table, then you're doing the steps. That's what it is to build a table. So there's no real question as to how that's possible. That's easy. Second, the assertoric hypothetical imperatives, which aim at happiness and are expressed via counsels of prudence. Well, the necessitation of the will, or the way in which the will is moved to act, is the same as in the above case. Again, the only difference here is that we lack a clear concept of happiness, so we can only make general prudential judgments rather than give strict instructions. Finally, we come to the categorical imperative, which again aims at no object whatsoever, but is willed simply in accordance with the universal moral law, and is expressed via universal and necessary laws of reason. Kant says, quote, the question of how the imperative of morality is possible is no doubt the only one in need of a solution, since it is not hypothetical at all, and thus the objectively represented necessity cannot rely on any presupposition, as in the case of the hypothetical imperatives. So the image I have here to the right is Arjuna speaking to Krishna. The two central, Krishna being one of the central deities or figures in the Hindu religion, Arjuna is a warrior who seeks out Krishna's counsel as to how he can be a good person, how he can do his duty, these sorts of things, right? Hence the connection here to what we're asking, because this is the only question that needs asking. How is it possible to follow the categorical imperative, which tells us not to act on the basis of any interest or any object, but simply on the basis of the law? But we might ask, well, what does he mean exactly, right? Why don't we just do it? He says, well, follow the law, act on the basis of act on the basis of morality. Just do that. Why can't I just do that? Why is this a difficult question? His question is this: how is it possible for us to act on the basis of a completely pure rational command, disconnected from any sensuous inclination or object of desire? Right? John Stuart Mill denies that it's possible to do this. This is why Mill says it's only possible to act on the basis of pleasure and the absence of pain. That is the only thing we can act on. We can only be motivated by pleasure and pain, by sensuous material objects. What Kant is proposing is a metaphysic of morals, that we act not on the basis of desire for objects, but based on pure rational respect. But how is that possible? Mill denies that it's possible. So what is Kant's account here as to how this is possible? Again, recall that he's trying to cleanse anthropology from this account and to investigate and identify the supreme formal principle of the will, which he has identified as rational adherence to the categorical imperative. But how's that possible? Again, we've seen the formal principle, and in such an act of will, there is nothing material for my will to be moved or motivated by. My will must be utterly pure and motivated only by the demands of duty as such. And that's what he's asking. How is that possible? What story could we tell as to how that's possible? Well, it will only be possible, Kant says, to follow the demands of the moral law, i.e. to act on the basis of a categorical imperative, if we possess freedom of will. Now we're getting into sort of deep metaphysical waters. What is freedom of will? Well, Kant's account is complex and will be highly simplified here, but it comes down at root to the capacity to be autonomous or self-determined. When I act on the basis of this or that object of desire, right? When I decide I'm going to work on my skiing because I want the pleasure of being a good skier, or I'm going to, build a house because I want to live in it. When I do that, when I act in relation to my desires or inclinations, in a way, I am compelled so to act by that external object of desire. I get up, I walk, and I get a drink of water. In a way, I'm compelled by my need for water, by my animal nature and my dependence upon water and food. It's playing a role in determining my will. By contrast, when I act on the basis of the moral law, I act only according to the necessary laws of reason, which I discover within reason and then give to myself. So freedom of will on Kant's view is not the ability to do whatever I want. That's all hypothetical stuff. That's all objects of desire. It is, by contrast, the ability to self-legislate, to act only in those ways that I know as a rational being are correct. Now, in this presentation, I'm not going to be giving you an account and a defense of Kant's theory of freedom of will, because it's too complicated and we don't have time. But I will simply say this: he does give such an account. There's a third section to the groundwork that we are not reading. That is where he gives much of his initial answer to this question, and then he goes on to write several more books attempting to explain what this is and how it's possible. Now you might wonder, well, why is this so difficult? Everyone knows we have free will. Well, everyone doesn't know that, and everyone doesn't agree about that. I think we have free will, but it's a difficult question, because freedom of will in this sense would seem to indicate that we had a unique causal power, right? When a rock falls down a mountain, it is necessitated to do that by external things. And a lot of the things that I do are necessitated by external things, right? I didn't choose to have the DNA that I have. I didn't choose the language I was taught or the family I had or any of those things. Those things were all given to me. They all happened to me. So a lot of people think, since all of these things, including very foundational things about myself, my genetic code, my family, my nation, my language, since these things were all determined with no input from me, but were rather determined from the outside, perhaps everything about me is determined from the outside. Perhaps everything I do is determined by previous causes, by things outside of me and before me. And Kant rightly recognizes that if morality is to be possible, metaphysically speaking, then what's got to be in place is a robust freedom of will, whereby I can, as it were, act from pure a priori formal motivations rather than simply being dictated to by objects of desire. So again, I'm not going to give you the account here. If you're interested, I can direct you to that account. But Kant does have an account of how this works. And really one of the core insights as to how it's worked, I can give you this much at least. Kant says we can't prove theoretically or through science that we have freedom of will, because freedom of will is a metaphysical idea. But the fact that we feel this pull, the fact of the moral law and its call to us to act in these pure and good ways is in itself a type of evidence of freedom of will. It's a type of practical evidence that we do have freedom of will and that we have to act at least as if we knew that we did. So, the categorical imperative, the supreme principle of morality that we must freely adopt and live by in order to be moral agents. We will now turn to this in more detail. As we've seen, Kant has claimed that there is, quote, only a single categorical imperative, end quote. Well, this is correct, but this singular imperative, he goes on to say, can be formulated in three distinct ways. These distinct formulations of the categorical imperative are, first, the formula of universal law, second, the formula of humanity, third, the formula of autonomy. We will investigate each of these formulations in turn, beginning with the formula of universal law. The formula of universal law runs as follows. Quote, so act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. So recall that the word maxim means the choice, the nature of your will, your intentions, or the subjective rule that you are following. So what this formulation asks us to do is to act as though the maxim of my action were to, by my will, suddenly be a universal law of nature. That when I do this, this suddenly becomes the law that everyone else follows. Okay, so just think about that. Now just clear your head of all the previous stuff. Don't worry about hypothetical imperatives for the time being. Don't worry about freedom. Set all that stuff aside and just try to focus on this formulation, because I think that the whole will make a lot more sense once we understand exactly what he's up to with these specific formulations. So we have to act as if the maxim of our action were to become by our will a universal law of nature. This formula asks us to consider whether our actions would be rationally possible if the maxims they followed or expressed were universal laws of nature. Kant now considers four specific examples of specific duties grouped as follows. First, the perfect duties that we have to ourselves. The example he gives is the duty not to commit suicide. The second is the perfect duties we have to others. The example he gives that we've already seen is not to be dishonest, right? To be truthful with people. Third, the imperfect duties we have to ourselves. The example he gives is the duty to cultivate one's talents. And four, the imperfect duties we have to others. For example, the duty to help others in need. Now, obviously, we have a lot more duties than this, and Kant thinks that we do, right? He's not giving us an exhaustive list here. These are just particular examples. So, I mean, it's worth noting that how many pages and how many hours of these PowerPoints are we in now? And only now are we starting to get particular moral claims, right? Here are some particular commands that Kant thinks are absolute rules that we can't violate. We cannot commit suicide. We cannot lie. We must cultivate our talents, and we must help others in need. Normally, when you hear a moral account, you get these sorts of things right away, right? You get them on the first page. And that's a problem. We shouldn't be getting these on the first page. Kant is right to wait until he's well into the book to start giving us actual duties. Because we first have to lay the groundwork. We first have to discover the foundation, and only then can we be certain that these rules actually hold up under scrutiny, that they actually are laws of morality rather than being something else, wearing a moral guise or a moral disguise. So let's consider the perfect duties first. Perfect duties are strict duties, the universal violation of which is impossible to conceptually think. Now, the name perfect duties can be a little bit misleading. Perfect duties are distinguished from imperfect duties not by being better or more perfect or more important per se, but simply by the way in which they prescribe actions to us. So we have to fulfill imperfect duties just as much as we do perfect duties. The distinction here really is the way in which they're formulated. Perfect duties are formulated according to a strict criterion, whereas imperfect duties are set up by a rather wide criterion. So we'll see what that means. So the first duty he considers is the duty not to commit suicide, right? And he calls this a perfect duty to oneself. Now stop for a moment and just think about suicide. Is it wrong? I mean, don't even think about it from Kant's perspective for the moment. Just think about it as a human being. Is it wrong to commit suicide? Well, most religions and most moral systems say yes, it is. It's wrong to commit suicide. But the more interesting question is, okay, why is it wrong to commit suicide? And there we get a widely divergent set of answers. If we were to look at it through a utilitarian lens, Mill would probably say something like this. It's wrong to commit suicide because on the whole, it tends to produce more pain than pleasure, right? It's going to create a lot of pain for your survivors, for your family members, your parents, or your children, or your siblings, or your friends, or whatever, right? It'll probably produce more pain than pleasure. However, of course, as always with Mill, there are certainly going to be situations where suicide would produce more pleasure than pain. If someone's in excruciating pain and their family would rather see them not be in pain, then yeah, euthanasia or something like that. That would be a moral choice on Mill's view, right? Others might say, you know, suicide is wrong because it violates God's will, right? We are God's property, so we cannot destroy ourselves, right? Those are probably two of the most common arguments one will hear about the wrongness of suicide, right? Either suicide is wrong because it causes pain to other people, or suicide is wrong because it violates God's commands. Kant is obviously not going to use either of those arguments, but he does think that this is a perfect duty we have to continue living, not to shorten our lives. So he considers in particular here a suicide of despair, someone who's in deep despair and doesn't want to live anymore. Now let's think about this person. Of course, this is an incredibly sad and difficult position to be in. The despairing person, it would seem, kills themselves in order not to suffer anymore, right? That's why they do it. They do it because they're tired of being in pain. Thus, we might say that they kill themselves out of a motive of self-love. Now, that sounds paradoxical at first, but it's exactly what's actually going on, right? They say, you know, I don't want to suffer. Well, not wanting to suffer is a perfectly understandable motivation, and that's a desire of self-love. I love myself, and I hate it when I'm in pain, and this life is pain, so I want to end it. So the suicide acts out of a feeling of self-love. However, right, the problem with this is, as Kant goes on to say, that, quote, a nature whose law it were to destroy life itself by means of the same sensation, the function of which it is to impel towards the advancement of life, would contradict itself, and would thus not subsist as a nature. All right, what in the world is he saying here? Excuse me. Well, recall what we're after. We're trying to ask whether the maxim of a given action would make sense, as it were, or would be rationally coherent if it were made a universal law of nature by my will. So the maxim of the suicide of despair's action, the maxim of this person's action is, I will kill myself when my life promises more pain than pleasure, right? Or in other words, out of self-love, I will shorten my life in order not to suffer. What if that were made a universal law of nature? What if all people killed themselves out of self-love? Well, he says, a nature whose law it were to destroy life itself by means of the same sensation, the function of which it is to impel towards the advancement of life, would contradict itself. Now, what is this sensation he's talking about? It's self-love. What is self-love? Self-love is what keeps us alive. Self-love is what helps us to, you know, eat and drink and sleep and jump out of the way of speeding buses and so on and so forth. Self-love is, you know, self-preservation. And to kill oneself out of self-love is deeply paradoxical. If there was an organism or a universal law dictating organisms like human beings, wherein the same law preserved the organism but also destroyed it, then that thing could not subsist as an organism. It would be like a flower whose roots simultaneously nourished it and choked it to death. So the maxim of his action, which is, I love myself so much I have to destroy myself, if universalized, would mean that there was no human beings in the first place, because such a nature, such a universal law would be conceptually incoherent. You can't even think about it. It's so deeply paradoxical. So, since killing myself involves violating a universal law of reason, I can't do it. Next duty, the duty to be honest, the perfect duty to others. Well, we've already seen this account in the first PowerPoint, right? And it's very basic and very intuitive and very powerful. A lie only succeeds if it's believed. So if the maxim of my action, which is I will lie when it suits me, if that were universalized and everyone acted that way, my lie would fail. It would no longer be possible to get away with lies. Thus, a universal law to lie is entirely incoherent, for no lie would ever succeed. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment and thinking about precisely what's going on when someone tells a lie. When someone lies, what they're effectively doing is this. They're saying to someone else without saying it, they are implicitly saying, I want to be able to take advantage of you. I want to be able to use you for my own purposes, right? Because I know if I tell you the truth, I won't get what I want. So what I'm going to do is tell a lie. Now, if everyone did that, my lie would fail, but I don't care about that because I'm me and I want to get what I want because I'm special. I want the rest of you to keep following the rule of truthfulness, because only if you do will my lie work in the first place. So good job, everybody. Keep being honest so that I can keep taking advantage of you. Right? That's what happens in the heart of the liar. They don't think that explicitly, probably, right? But that's what is going on when someone lies. They are making themselves an exception to a rule that they demand everyone else follows. Right? Even liars hate other liars. No one can respect a liar because what they're doing is fundamentally incoherent. They themselves are relying upon the rule of truth-telling in order to break it. That is fundamentally immoral. Just like the suicide is relying upon there being such a thing as human nature in the first place in order for them to destroy it in their own person. They are acting in a self-contradictory way, and that's immoral. Next, we have the imperfect duties. These are wide duties, the universal violation of which is possible to think, but not to will. Unlike perfect duties, which can only be correctly performed in one way, for instance, there's only one way to tell the truth, and that's to tell the truth. Imperfect duties can be performed in a wide variety of ways. There's more latitude here in how we perform them and how we carry them out. So what are some examples? Well, the first is the duty to cultivate our talents, right? This is an imperfect duty to self. It's imperfect in this sense because there's any number of ways I can do it, right? So for instance, I have some talents intellectually. I'm pretty good at philosophy, but I was also pretty good when I was young at history, and I could have gone into history instead of philosophy, right? My bachelor's degree was in history, and I could have pursued a graduate career and an eventual job in history. I decided not to. I liked philosophy better, so I cultivated those talents. Fine, Kant's going to say, it's up to you which talents you want to cultivate. You just have to cultivate some of them, right? You can kind of choose which way you want to take this, but you can't just sit around and do nothing. Well, why not? Why can't we sit around and do nothing? Suppose that you're in favorable circumstances, right? Say you inherit $20 million. Is it morally permissible for you to buy a mansion on a remote island and waste your days in frivolous luxury, not developing your talents? Why shouldn't you just do that? A lot of people do, right? A lot of people with a lot of money don't work at all to develop themselves. They just soak up pleasure like a sponge. What's wrong with that? Well, the world could arguably subsist if this were done, right? Now, Kant has a sort of contentious and somewhat problematic little aside here in this section. He says, look, something like this. He says, look, the world could no doubt subsist if everyone were to sit around and let their talents rust like people do in the South Sea Islands. Now, it's a very unfair characterization of the South Sea Islands, about which Kant almost certainly knew, very little, but he liked reading travel logs and geography books about different parts of the world that were being explored during his lifetime. And he formed an opinion that was common at the time that the South Sea Islands, places like Tahiti and so forth, were just tropical paradises where people laid around and did nothing. Just laid around on the beach and ate coconuts and stuff. Now, of course, that's not true. It represents Kant's time and place and sort of a basic and somewhat ignorant view of the nature of life there. But there's a point here if we separate it from this kind of problematic characterization. Suppose that there were a place where fruit was so plentiful and fresh water was abundant and everything was provided for by nature. And so suppose there was such a place, and in that place people just kind of laid around and did nothing. Well, if the whole world were like that, yeah, sure, the world could keep going that way if people didn't cultivate their talents. But the world and human civilization within it would not grow or flourish. And the problem here with the plan of moving to the island, having a big house built, and then just spending your days in idle luxury, reading books, watching movies, going on vacations, the problem is that you couldn't do that if everyone else did what you were about to do, right? If everybody decided just to sit around and let their talents rust, who would build your mansion, right? Who would fly the plane that took you to your various destinations? Who would mix up your Mai Tais and your various cocktails? Who would build your jet skis and your yachts? There would be nobody to do any of those things. So the problem with not cultivating our talents is, once again, that we're giving ourselves a pass when it comes to things that we expect others to do. If all I want to do is sit around and play PlayStation, well, if everyone did that, there would be no PlayStation, right? I've made myself a useless member of society and instead have just sat and sponged off of everyone else. I have expected them to do the work that I'm not willing to do. And that's incoherent. That's contradictory. There's nothing special about me such that I should get a pass when I expect everyone else to work. If everyone else has to work, I have to work. But this is the basic idea of Kant's ethics, that it should be just, it should be fair. If you can't do it such that everyone else could do it, then you're doing something wrong. If only you get to do this, then you've made a mistake. Finally, the duty to help others, which is the imperfect duty to others. Well, why do I have to help others? Well, in short, because no one can coherently will that no one ever helps anyone, right? For in trying to do that, if my maxim is I don't want to help anybody, well, if nobody did that, then I would rob myself of all hope of future assistance. But I need help from others all the time. All of us do. Human beings are social creatures, and we need help from others. So if I decide I don't want to help anybody, right? If that were a universal law, then no one would help me, and I can't possibly will that because I need help. So the long and the short of this whole formula of universal law is simply act in a fair manner, right? Only do those things that everyone can do. You don't get a special exception when it comes to morality. You're bound by the same rules as everybody else. The second formula of the categorical imperative, and to my mind the most important one, is the formula of humanity. When we talk about universalizability, we're talking, as it were, about the form or the shape of a good action. The form or shape of a good action is that it's universalizable. Everyone can do it. But universalizability is not the purpose of our moral actions, right? It's not the reason we're doing what we're doing. It's just simply the form or the shape. That's too abstract and logical to be a goal. So what is the purpose of our actions? Right? Why do we do what we do? Well, obviously, we act for any number of purposes in our day-to-day life: money, pleasure, power, fame, honor, and all the specific things that fall into these headings. However, as we know, to act in these ways is to follow merely hypothetical imperatives, such as invest if you wish to be rich, run for office if you seek power, and so forth. So what then is the purpose or end of moral action? It's not money, right? It's not speedboats. It's not power. It's not fame. What is it? Kant, in one of the most beautiful lines in the history of human writing, says, quote, "Now I say, a human being, and generally every rational being, exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means for the discretionary use of this or that will, but must in all its actions, whether directed towards itself or also to other rational beings, always be considered at the same time as an end." What he's saying is this: the point, purpose, or end, goal of moral action is humanity as such, and not humanity in the abstract, but a human being, a rational being. That is why we care about morality. It's not wrong to murder people because it offends against an abstract formulation of reason. It's wrong to murder people because it offends against rational beings, right? It destroys a rational person, a being in whom reason inheres. We care about morality because we care about beings for whom morality is an issue, human beings. Here we have a Roman slave market. Slavery is one of the oldest institutions in the world. It's been practiced by nearly every major civilization in world history, and it's always been abhorrent and morally monstrous. So Kant says we can't simply treat others as mere means. Well, what does it mean to treat someone as a mere means, right? Think of the words means to an end. It means to use them the way we would use a tool, right? And slavery is the paradigmatic example of this. These are human beings on that scaffold being sold as if they were objects. There is nothing more offensive or monstrous to reason than the sight of something like this. A human being being sold as if it were a tool, being used as if it were an object. That is blatantly and fundamentally morally monstrous. I may use a shovel or a rake as a tool, sure, no problem, because they are tools. They are merely things. Quote, but a human being is not a thing, hence not something that can be used merely as a means, but must in all his actions be considered as an end in itself. The human being is not a mere means. Human beings are ends in themselves. To treat a human being as an end in itself is thus to treat them as what they are, a free, rational being with infinite value. Unlike a thing which has a mere price, a human being is priceless. One cannot set a value on a human being, for they possess something infinitely higher. Human beings possess dignity. Human beings are priceless. If I go to the store and I buy myself a shovel, the clerk says that'll be $25. I say, okay, fair price. That's a fair price for this. If I were to go and point to someone and say, hey, how much for them? I'd like to buy them, right? Now I'm acting like a complete monster. That's not the sort of thing you can sell. That's the sort of thing that is a center of value, right? The shovel isn't a center of value. The shovel is useful as a tool, but a human being isn't a tool. A human being is the sort of thing who uses tools. You cannot treat someone else as a tool. This is why we hate it more than anything else when we feel or find out that people have been using us. If you found out that someone has been using you, you're not just like offended, you're not just sort of miffed by it, you are deeply and almost mortally affronted. Our response to this is, how dare you, right? I am not a thing for you to use. I am not a slave for you to dictate to. I'm not the sort of thing that you can pick up and put to various purposes. I am a human being. My life has value, and not instrumental value, infinite value. I am invested with dignity, and you damn well better treat me with respect. You don't have to like me, but you have to respect me, because I'm a human being. I'm a rational agent. This is a powerful and beautiful idea. This is a powerful and beautiful recognition. And if you're interested, as I think we all are, in issues of human rights, issues of political freedoms, Kant is one of the major voices in that discussion. Kant was hugely influential in the growth of the concept of rights and human dignity, right? That humans are not things that we can put a price on or that we can use. Kant is really the thinker who first formally articulates and expresses this. It's one of his most lofty and elevating insights. Human beings are ends in themselves, and they deserve rational respect. We cannot simply use them. The second formula of the categorical imperative, the formula of humanity, which illustrates the end or goal of moral action, is thus: so act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Now let's focus on the word merely for a moment. Obviously, in a variety of ways, we do use people as means and they use us as means. For instance, if I go to the store and I buy that shovel and the clerk says $25, I hand him the money, right? In a sense, he's part of the transaction, right? I'm using him in order to get the shovel, and he's using me in order to earn money and have a job, right? Well, that's okay, provided it's not done with disrespect or a sort of ignorance of the other person's status as a human. Let me give you a very basic example of this. When I go to the grocery store, I work very hard never to be texting or checking my phone when I'm in the line talking to the person who's ringing up my groceries, right? I caught myself doing it once, and I thought, this is so incredibly rude of me, right? This is another human being across the aisle here doing a task, right, for me, in relation to me, and I can't even look up and say, hey, how's your day going, right? No, I'm not going to do that anymore, right? I have to have enough respect to say that's a person with a life, right, with feelings, with hopes and dreams, with a past and a future. Um, and I should be able to look at them to take 2 seconds out of my day and say, hey, how's it going? I hope you're having a good day, right? To treat them as a human being, to look at them, not to treat them like a robot who's there to serve me. It's a small thing, but it really matters. And I think that if you've had an experience, in customer service or in the dining industry, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's something so deeply offensive when people just ignore you. They write you off as if you're part of the furniture. Have the decency to look someone in the eye and say, I recognize you're a fellow human being. Thank you, right? I hope you have a good day. Those aren't just empty, trivial niceties. Things like that really matter. It really matters that we show people a basic respect that shows that we're cognizant of their dignity as a fellow member of the rational species of humanity. So, merely as a means would be to ignore that, right? Obviously, we have instrumental relations, but just take the time to be cognizant of this person as a person. So now we might wonder, well, what does this formulation have to do with the formula of universal law, right? Well, it expresses ultimately the exact same thing, just from a different angle. And we can see that if we consider the four duties that we looked at. Let's just hone in on one. Let's just hone in on the second example of telling the truth, right? When I lie to someone, what am I doing? I'm using them as a mere means. I am saying I don't respect your rational personhood. I look at you as an obstacle that has to be sort of weaseled past in order to get what I want, right? I will just deceive you and fool you and trick you because you're nothing to me, right? That's what the liar implicitly says. If I go to someone and say, hey, lend me $100, I'll pay you back next week. What I'm effectively saying is, to me, your rational personhood is worth $100, right? See you later. That's monstrous, right? And it's not universalizable because I would never consent to other people treating me that way. I would never allow myself to be treated that way. So how dare I treat other people that way? It expresses the same thing. It's not universalizable to act this way, just with the emphasis on the end or goal as opposed to the form or shape. The form or shape of the action is universalizability. The end or goal is rational humanity. Finally, we come to the formula of autonomy. The final formulation of the categorical imperative is the formula of autonomy, which is, quote, the idea of the will of every rational being as a universally legislating will. Okay, what does this mean? Well, consider the following. A law, as an imperative of practical reason, must, of course, have a lawgiver or a legislator. The law has to come from somewhere. It has to be legislated. It has to be given, right? In the case of, say, the laws of the state of Utah, well, they're made by the Utah State Legislature. In the case of federal laws, they're made by Congress. In the case of, so on and so forth. So who is the legislator, or what is the legislator of the moral law? Where does it come from? Who legislates? Who dictates it? Well, clearly it is not the state, right? We're not talking about civil laws or political laws. We're talking about the moral law. It's not the state. It's not a president. It's not a king or a queen. Neither on Kant's view is it God, right? Again, the relationship between God and the moral law is kind of tricky in Kant, but on Kant's view, God does not just will the moral law. God does not just create it. To follow the moral law is to act on the basis of nothing but one's own reason and the respect for the form of law as such, which reason makes manifest I must respect. Right? Reason shows me I have to respect this. I have to tell the truth to people. I have to treat them as ends in themselves because it would be irrational to do otherwise. Thus, if I were to follow the law simply to please my parents or to make my king happy or even to please God, I would not be following the law as a categorical imperative. I would rather be following a mere hypothetical imperative, such as, I will do what my parents say so as to please them. I want to make them happy. That's not following the categorical imperative. So no external being to me can legislate the law to me. I must give the law to myself, just as every rational being must give the law to themselves. So, the question, who is the legislator of the moral law? The answer is, I am. To myself, just as you are to yourself, and just as everyone is to themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that we all get to decide what the moral law is. We already know what the moral law is. It is always act such that the maxim of your action can hold as a universal law. Reason is what gives the law. But when it comes time to implement it, I have to do it myself, right? So I'm not saying everyone has a different law. Far from it. Everyone has the exact same law because it's a law of reason. The legislator is the reason within me, right? Not the desires, not the pathology, not the inclinations. The legislator is my reason. Thus, in order to follow the demands of the moral law, I must autonomously govern myself. Autonomy, which we saw above to be expressive of human freedom, means self-legislation. Auto is the word in Greek for self, nomos for law. So to be autonomos is to be self-legislated. And to be self-legislated means I don't have to await on the judgment of another in order to know what's right, right? I don't have to wait to hear what my dad tells me to do before I know what's right. I can see what's right and I can do it myself, right? My father can't be good for me. My mother can't be good for me. I have to be good for myself. My actions have moral worth if and only if I follow them through an autonomous decision to do what reason and morality demand. Each rational being is thus the king or queen of his or her own sovereign moral realm. No one can be good or bad for you. You must choose it for yourself. So I have this picture of the Emperor Napoleon, right? That is the role each of us has in relation to our own moral lives. No one else can sit on your moral throne but you. Your parents can't be good for you. Not even God in heaven can be good for you. You must choose to be good for yourself on the basis of an autonomous recognition of your duty and obligation. Then and only then can you be a moral agent. Kant claims that autonomy of the will is the supreme principle of morality and encompasses the other two, right? It is autonomy that shows me, yes, I must freely adopt the criterion of universalizability. I must act in such a way that everyone can. Reason makes it manifest. I must also respect other beings as, like me, being rational and autonomous agents. Like me, they are reasonable beings. They have hopes and dreams. They have desires, and most importantly, they have reason, right? Like me, they are centers of value, and like me, they must be respected. I must autonomously choose to respect them, not respect them because I think that maybe I'll get some favorable position or I'll earn money. I must respect them because they deserve it. So go back to the shopkeeper example from way back in section 1. The shopkeeper sells the flour to the child at a fair price, but not because he respects the child as a person, not because he respects the law of universalizability. He only does it because he doesn't want his business to suffer. He is acting opposite of autonomously. He is acting heteronomously, right, where the law is received from the outside. He only does what he does because he fears negative consequences. He is not yet a moral agent. Right? In that moment, he more resembles an animal than a human because all he's doing is shying away whimperingly from some perceived pain rather than saying, I know what my duty is, right, and I will do it. I know what I have to do, and who cares what the consequences are? I must do what's right. So just as we saw in section 1, a good will must be chosen, right? Now we're starting to see what a good will is. It's a will that chooses on the basis of the categorical imperative. It must be chosen, and not on grounds of desire and inclination, which are subjective and contingent, but rather on grounds of pure reason. This pure and free choice is what is meant by autonomy. Finally, we come to the kingdom of ends. Kant says, quote, the concept of every rational being that must consider itself as universally legislating through all the maxims of its will, so as to judge itself and its actions from this point of view, leads to a very fruitful concept attached to it, namely that of a kingdom of ends. By a kingdom, however, I understand the systematic union of several rational beings through common laws. For all rational beings stand under the law that each of them is to treat itself and all others never merely as means, but always at the same time as an end in itself. But by this there arises a systematic union of rational beings through common objective laws, i.e. a kingdom, which, because what these laws have as their purpose is precisely the reference of these beings to one another as ends and means, can be called a kingdom of ends, of course only as an ideal. Morality thus consists in referring all actions to the referring all action to the legislation by which alone a kingdom of ends is possible. Right? So what is this kingdom of ends? Well, it's only an ideal. It's an abstract thought. Kant says, human beings are simply too imperfect to ever realize this. But such a kingdom would be a world in which people acted in accordance with rational principles, where we didn't use each other, didn't torment each other, didn't take advantage of each other for our own gain, didn't look at each other as means that I could step on so I could get ahead, but instead all of us treated one another as what we are, rational ends, worthy of universal respect. So this is kind of Kant's vision of heaven in a way, right? Not something realizable on this earth, but always an ideal to keep in mind when you act. Before you do something, think, is this action in accordance with what a kingdom of ends would be like? If not, I shouldn't do it. One more time then, we come to the will at the crossroads. This is where we all stand, and this and the next slide are going to be an overall summary of what Kant is saying here. Again, we've been through a lot of material, a lot of very difficult material. It's a lot of terms, and it's easy to get lost in the minutia. But the overall message is clear and sublime. It is piercingly beautiful, what Kant is saying here. Here's our will, standing between its two sources of motivation. On the one hand, we have everything that we want. All these things, these objects that we think will make us happy, right? Of course, we don't know that they will because there's no guarantee, there's no science of happiness, but we want them nonetheless. Now, as I've said, there's nothing wrong with wanting these things, provided they don't conflict with what morality demands. However, they often do conflict. To make money, I often have to deprive others of it. To gain honor, I often have to do underhanded things in shady corners, right, in back alleys. To obtain pleasure, I oftentimes have to step on others to get there, even more so with power, right? All of these things often and very swiftly can conflict with what morality demands. So what do, right? What does it mean to be a good person on Kant's view? It means to follow the moral law, right? Rather than taking my cues from the right side of the equation here, rather than seeking money and honor at all costs, what I do is I stop and think, what should I be, right? What sort of a person should I be? Should I be the sort of person who chases money regardless of how shameful it makes me? Should I be the sort of person who claws after power regardless of how many bloody bodies I leave behind me? Or should I be the sort of person who stops and thinks, you know what, I ought to act according to the basic dictates of reason. I ought to act fairly. I ought to act in such a way that I treat rational beings as ends. I ought to act freely and autonomously and direct myself in action throughout my own life. That's the kind of person I should be. On the other hand, someone might give their life over to these material objects, right? The form of that will is nothing and anything, right? There is no form or shape to such a will. It's shapeless and amorphous because all they do is seek after whatever pleasure happens to catch their attention next. The end or the goal of such actions, any possible object of desire, whatever happens to please you. The legislative force, heteronomy, receiving the rule from outside myself, and the nature of my action constrained and determined, led about like a dog on a leash or a donkey chasing a carrot, hungering after the next pleasure or fearful of the next pain. That's no way to live. That's the way an animal lives. A human being stands up on their feet, right, looks at the stars, puts the crown of duty upon their head and mounts the steps to their own throne, the throne of their sovereign moral kingdom, and they sit and say, I will rule myself and I will act in accordance with rational principle. We come full circle now, back to where we began with Kant's claim that the good will alone is good without limitation. Now we know what this means. We see now, where we only dimly anticipated before in section 1, what this goodwill is. The goodwill is the practical reason of a rational agent that determines itself to action on the basis of universal moral laws made manifest by reason. So goodwill is not good feeling. Goodwill is not good wishing. Goodwill is good action, informed by practical reason on the basis of universal moral laws. The goodwill thus acts on the basis of universalizable maxims, the form of a goodwill expressed in the formula of universal law. It acts for the end of rational personhood, the end or goal of a goodwill, made clear in the formula of humanity. And finally, the goodwill self-legislates all good maxims to itself simply because they are good, representing the complete coherence of the will with the supreme principle of will as such. The goodwill is practical reason doing what it knows it ought to, following the moral law because it is the moral law. Thanks, I will see you next time.